Welcome back. The opioid epidemic has understandably been knocked from the front pages by the COVID outbreak, the election, and all the seemingly huge stories that have been breaking every day in 2020. But the pandemic, believe it or not, could be making the issue of addictions even worse. And I'm going to quote now from a special report in The Guardian. The American Medical Association said it was greatly concerned at reported increases in opioid overdoses in more than 30 states, although it will be months before hard data is available. Public officials, health officials from Kentucky, Florida, Texas, and Colorado, they have recorded surges in opioid deaths as the economic and social anxieties created by COVID-19 proved fertile ground for addiction. And you can't talk about this without discussing OxyContin and, directly, the Sackler family who owns Purdue Pharma, the drug company that produced it. Now, the Sacklers, they're one of America's wealthiest families. They made a lot of their billions on Oxy. Purdue, they filed for bankruptcy as it was facing hundreds of lawsuits that claimed the company aggressively marketed the drug, which helped fuel an addiction crisis. Now, emails from the former company president, Richard Sackler, they were released, and they do not paint a pretty picture. I now read a couple of them for you. We have to hammer on abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals. Another one, showing him responding to disappointing sales. I had hoped for better results. What else more can we do to energize the sales and grow at a faster rate? My next guest wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times saying that the Sacklers could actually get away with it and not face justice. He's also the best-selling author of Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Let's bring in Gerald Posner. Gerald, we spoke seemingly a different generation ago, given what's happened this last year, about your book. Remind, though, the audience, first of all, we have a long history, and I learned this from your book, about Big Pharma at times of crisis profiting from this, but moreover, directly to the Sacklers, just how, with knowledge and intent, they tried to spread OxyContin, even in communities, and maybe particularly in communities where they knew that there was high rates of abuse and addiction. None of this came as a surprise to them.
That's absolutely right, Richard. What's interesting about OxyContin, the people sometimes say, well, there were a lot of opioid painkillers, but OxyContin was the revolutionary one. It's the one that changed the business, because when it came out in 1996, it was the first time that an opioid painkiller had an extended release shell. So instead of having to take it every 4 hours, what are called instant release pills, you're able to take it twice a day. Every 12 hours was the promise. And Purdue was able to get, when they came out, an FDA statement that said as a result of that, it was probably less subject to abuse and addiction than normal opioid painkillers. They knew at the time there was no study that supported that. And over time, it started and fueled the opioid epidemic. That drug, as you said, sold $35 billion in sales. It made the Sacklers multi-billionaires. Those sales teams that they sent out always exhorted to sell more and more and more at higher doses. They targeted the doctors who were dispensing the most. They made sure the distributors weren't reporting any of the pill mills. They hid all that information. And when it finally comes time for reckoning, because there are 2,600 suits against Purdue, it files bankruptcy last September. And there are hundreds of suits, including 25 by state's attorney general against the Sackler family, because they owned it and directed the company at the time all this was going on. Guess what? They didn't file bankruptcy, but they go before the court and they say, will you please stop all the lawsuits against us? We might contribute some money to an overall settlement if we get full liability releases. And that's why they may avoid justice in this. It's disgraceful.
And that, putting it politely, without doing a treatise on bankruptcy law, the short of it is, and hopefully the majority of my audience has no experience with this, but you have to, in legal terms, debts can be discharged only when you commit the full value of all the assets, with maybe the exception of a primary home. That's not remotely, Gerald, what the Sacklers are talking about. I know they offered up $3 billion, but that's a rounding number given all the monies that they made for this. And unfortunately, as you guys explained in your piece today, they may have precedent, a 1985 case that they can point to and say, hey, you guys did it for them, you should do it for us.
As a matter of fact, it's really interesting because your audience will understand this. So without knowing anything about bankruptcy law, they know that you get a second chance in America. If you can't pay your bills, you go personally bankrupt, or if a company goes bankrupt, the company can sometimes get reorganized. It emerges from bankruptcy as a different company. That happens. But what's happening here is different because the company, Purdue, did go bankrupt, but the Sacklers didn't. They just showed up and they said, by the way, we're attached to the company. And there is this case from the mid-'80s. It was called the Dalcon Shield. It was a contraceptive device, an IUD. And thousands of women were injured by that. The company went bankrupt, and the family that owned it was worth a lot of money. They showed up like the Sacklers did and said, by the way, stop all the lawsuits against us. They said we know what was going on, and let us emerge from here with some of our money. The same thing happened with Drexel, Burnham, Lambert. The junk bond king, Milken, and about 200 top executives walked out. They never declared bankruptcy. They walked out with most of their fortunes intact after that because the court did the same thing. And what gets me so infuriated here, I'm a lawyer, a non-practicing lawyer, but I wrote this piece with a bankruptcy law professor, is that the bankruptcy courts have no power for this by statute. Congress never gave it to them. The Supreme Court's never given it to them. They've created it on their own. Nobody's reined it in since the Robbins case in the 80s. It's going to happen again with Purdue unless somebody stops it in Congress or the Supreme Court overturns this.
I can only imagine, Gerald, if I'm a family and unfortunately, given the hundreds of thousands of families that unfortunately can probably nod their heads when they hear this question. I lost my child to a heroin addiction, and here are the Sacklers who profited off of creating a drug. What did they know when they marketed their product? And did they knowingly and falsely make it sound like there was no risk attached? And as you've done in your book, I mean, if I lived in West Virginia or Kentucky, there were counties where they would look at the data being unbelievably through the roof, and they'd flood the market with even more product. So they're never going to have to face the music if a court says they get a pass on them. And you dealt with families. I can only imagine what was going through their minds if the Sacklers, at the end of the day, are sitting on billions.
Richard, you're exactly right. The part that, I get as a journalist, get into the subject and it infuriates me and my blood pressure gets up. But when I talk to the families, I talk to those people, some of them are victims themselves. They've spent thousands of dollars on rehab and trying to get their lives together. They've been fired from their work. They had divorces. They lost contact with their children because they became addicts. Other instances of mothers or fathers who lost a son or a daughter. I've talked to people who lost a sister and brother. It's heart-rending. And they've been waiting for their day of reckoning. You're right. In pharma, I have chapters titled essentially A Crime Family. That quotes a New York professor who looked into this question of what was happening with the family. I talk about the extent to which I believe the family knew and directed what was going on. But we've been waiting for a long time, the families have, the victims have, for a court of law where there's real discovery. And guess what? Bankruptcy is not where that's done. You don't get discovery to find out not only what transpired, but there's no trial, there's no court record in bankruptcy, there's nothing left at the end for people to look to, there's no accountability, there's no admission by any Sackler of responsibility for anything, and that's the part. Even some of the attorneys general, Richard, who believe that the Sacklers might have, they don't know, they've raised the suspicion. Did they transfer some funds before this? Did they strip some assets out of the corporation? That discovery needs to be done, but it may not be done in bankruptcy court. So this is very frustrating on so many levels.
Finally, before I let you leave me, Gerald, one thing you get from the book, and again, Gerald didn't come on to push the book, but it's called Pharma. It's one of the best reads on the subject of big pharma, and looks at the historical, not just the window we're dealing right now is. But take me down the road. Hopefully we do get a vaccine for COVID. What are you going to be investigating a year from now is your guess? Because already we're reading that there's been a lot of middlemen that have been involved in this process that had no qualifications. It was through relationships with this administration here. And there always seems to be, I remember from your book, people who end up and not just profiting a little bit, obscenely when we're going through a national crisis. First guess this for me. What are you concerned about that people aren't watching now before the vaccine is created and hopefully widely distributed?
I think that I have two big concerns. One is that the vaccine is, people have a high expectation for the vaccine. They think of it like the polio vaccine. You're going to take a sugar cube and have lifetime immunity. You'll never have to worry about COVID again. That's not the vaccine that's being worked on by a dozen companies racing to the finish line now. They are working on a vaccine. The FDA has set the bar very low, which is 50% efficacy, which means that for every 2 people who get the vaccine, 1 of them will have to show antibodies, some natural immunity to fight off COVID. That's a pretty low bar. On a good year, the flu vaccine injection covers 70%. So 50% means we're going to see a vaccine that needs to be given again the following year, booster shots to be given. And that's where the pricing comes in. The government has already agreed to buy 100 million doses from Pfizer at $19.50 each, so that's almost $2 billion. We don't know the cost of those to Pfizer, maybe $10 to $8. That's what some experts think. So we're giving them double the price, and we have a commitment to buy another 500 million after that at prices to be determined. We don't even know if the Pfizer vaccine will be the best of the group. So I'm worried about the government coming to contracts on which it's setting prices without knowing what the eventual product is. This is much too early. We're giving away the goods too easily without really waiting to see what we have and negotiating it well.
Gerald, I always appreciate the time, and if you folks haven't gotten to see the piece in the Times today, the Sacklers could get away with it. It's worth your time to read. Gerald Posner, thank you again.
Richard, thanks so much for covering it. I appreciate it.
Up next, more good news for Joe Biden as he surges ahead in several swing states, and now even Texas could be in play after the break. One of the top officials in Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, she'll join us with her take on the race.